Hilkhot Teshuva, like other chapters in the Mishneh Torah, is itself a fabulous chidush, a legal innovation of Rambam. Rambam here created a legal category that is not found in the Talmud or in the Geonim. Ramban Nachmanides made this observation and actually wrote a beautiful poem about this. I want to read to you from Kitvei HaRamban, collected by Rabbi Shavel. This appears in volume 1, page 343. I retyped it and created my own translation because it's poetic. It's not easy to translate. Ramban says as follows: Yoreh chot'im derech behilchot teshuva. The sinner should find his way to Hilkhot Teshuva. Ubenachat v'shuva ubli kushiot v'havayot mafik margaliot. And patiently return without questions or doubts, for it produces precious stones. Ki lo matzinu divrei tshuva batalmud rak mefuzarim umefuradim. We have not found a compilation on Teshuvah in the Talmud except scattered ideas. Bein hahalachot v'ha'agadot bli berurim. Sporadic laws in Agadot, unexplained. Ubechol chiburei geonim harishonim v'acharonim lo matzinu otam inyanim drushim lechol chevtzehem umezumanim. Neither in the works of the Geonim, earlier or later commentaries, have we seen these laws organized and prepared. Kasher heima mefurashim umevuarim basefer hahu hamemule mipninim, as they are here explained in this book filled with insight. Hamiyusad bisapirim mibachutz umipnim, founded in sapphires both in and out. Magnificent. Ramban, who so often takes issue with Rambam, had great admiration for the Nesher Hagadol, the great eagle. We see here his profound appreciation for Hilkhot Teshuva, and in particular for Rambam's legal innovation for creating this category of halakha. Hilkhot Teshuva appears in the volume called Mada, which deals with the fundamentals of Judaism, alongside Hilkhot Deot, laws that deal with character, Yesodei HaTorah, fundamentals of the Torah, Talmud Torah, the study of Torah, Hilkhot Avodah Zarah, the laws and prohibitions of idol worship, and it consists of 10 chapters. Rambam subsumes under the category of Teshuvah lofty topics such as love of Hashem, cleaving to Hashem, principles of faith, divine providence, freedom of will, reward and punishment, resurrection, Mashiach, and the world to come. According to Rambam, all these topics are intimately related to Teshuvah. It is clearly a topic that is all-encompassing. It embraces the total religious experience, even as it embodies the complete Torah imperative. The Gemara in Masechet Brachot, Daf Yud Zayin Amud Aleph, alludes to the lofty subject matter when it states, Tachlit Chochma Teshuvah. The consequence of wisdom is Teshuvah. Teshuvah in substance and as a religious practice subsumes the totality of religious commitment and of the religious personality. Put differently, the Talmud is telling us that the purpose and goal of one's actions and intellectual and spiritual striving is Teshuvah, the return to Hashem by embracing divine wisdom and the observance of mitzvot. I want to reveal here an idea that is often lost when studying Hilkhot Teshuva, but it is critical to understanding the subject matter and fully appreciating Hilkhot Teshuva. When we speak of Teshuva, we have to recognize that there are two aspects of this principle. Two different manifestations of what we call Teshuvah. There is Teshuvah that is the result of sin. I will call this sin-motivated Teshuvah. This Teshuvah is finite, definable, and identifiable. I know the sin, and halakha gives me direction about how to correct the transgression. Then you have Teshuvah that is open-ended, a lifelong religious experience. It is the constant pursuit of seeking Hashem out. The former lends itself to codification and the formal process, while the latter involves free will, divine providence, love of Hashem, the world to come, etc., the many topics subsumed under Teshuvah. This distinction of categories actually finds expressions in the Nevi'im, in the prophets. When Malachi Navi says, Shuva Yisrael, Shuva Elai, Va'ashuva Aleichem, Hashem speaks to the Jewish people and says, return to me, says Hashem, and I will return to you. The Navi, the prophet, is not talking about a specific sin, but rather of a mutual movement between the human being and Hashem. The human being comes close to Hashem and Hashem comes close to the human being. In contrast, when Hosea says, Shuva Yisrael el Hashem Elohecha ki chashalta ba'avonecha, return to the Lord your God for you have sinned. Or when Yechezkel says, Beshuv Rasha merish'o, the sinner must return from his sin. Here we are talking about Teshuvah that is identified or linked to a specific sin. There is a precedent for this kind of distinction. There's a mitzvah, Et Hashem Elohecha Tira. The Lord your God you shall fear. Rambam in Sefer HaMitzvot, mitzvah number 4, writes as follows: Hi hatzivui shenitztavinu lehamin beyirato. This mitzvah refers to the commandment that we are commanded to believe in the fear of God, it ale umorato, and Hashem's fear, ubal niyeshananim ubotchim. We cannot be complacent or overconfident. Ella, rather, nechake v'nachush lebiat onsho it ale becholet. Rather, we have to wait and expect God's punishment at any moment. Here, Rambam is clearly speaking of being in a constant state of fear. Fear of the consequence of our actions. But Rambam also speaks of a different kind of yirah, a different kind of fear. In Hilkhot Yesodei Torah, chapter 2, Halacha Bet, Rambam says the following: what is the path to love Hashem and to fear Hashem? Rambam says, when one contemplates God's actions, God's wonderful and great creations, and he realizes that this is infinite wisdom of Hashem. Miyad, immediately, hu ohev, and Rambam says, miyad, hu nitra le'achorav ve'yira ve'yifchad. Immediately, he pulls back, and he is afraid, yirah. This fear that Rambam describes in Hilkhot Yesodei Torah might better be translated as awe. It is not fear of sin, but rather being in awe of Hashem's wonders. Yirah here is a state of mind that is boundless. It is a state of mind that defines me as a religious, spiritual person. So what we find here is that the same mitzvah, yirah, has a manifestation, fear of sin, but it also is manifest in something much larger and much greater, this unbounded sense of yira. So, as we go through Hilkhot Teshuva of Rambam, we have to be on constant alert. Is he describing sin-related teshuvah or the open-ended teshuvah? This distinction, I believe, answers a question that has divided commentaries of Rambam ever since the Mishneh Torah was published, up until today. Is teshuvah a mitzvah deoraita or not? The pasuk at the end of Devarim says the following. I'm reading from Sefer Devarim, Perek Lamed, the beginning of Perek Lamed. V'haya ki yavo alecha kol hadvarim ha'ele habracha ve'haklala. These things will happen to you, both the blessings and the curses. Asher natati lefanecha, that Hashem says, I have brought before you. V'hashevota el levavecha. You will then have a reversal of heart. B'chol hagoyim asher hidichacha Hashem Elohecha shama, amongst the nations where God banished you. V'shafta ad Hashem Elohecha v'shamata b'kolo, and the pasuk says v'shafta, and you will return to the Lord your God, and you will listen to His commandments. Ramban, Nachmanides, again not to be confused with Rambam, Maimonides, argues that this verse, this pasuk, is the source for a biblical commandment, teshuvah. In other words, teshuvah for Ramban is a mitzvah deoraita. The pasuk says you must return to Hashem, you must do teshuvah. Rambam, Maimonides, reads this verse very differently. And in order to see how Rambam understands this verse, we're going to go straight to where he discusses it. Chapter 7, Halacha Hey. Let's see. Rambam says the following. Kol hanevim kulam tzivu al ha-teshuvah. The prophets have commanded us regarding teshuvah. Ve'ein Israel nigalin ella b'teshuvah. Redemption will ultimately come only with regards to teshuvah or through teshuvah. Ukvar hifticha Torah shesof Israel lasot teshuvah besof galutan umiyad hem nigalim. And the Torah has promised us that in the end of days, ultimately the Jewish people will do teshuvah while they are in galut, in the diaspora, and they will be redeemed. Shene'emar v'haya ki yavo alecha kol hadvarim ha'ele v'shafta ad Hashem Elohecha. And the time will come when all these things will come upon you, v'shafta, and you will return to Hashem, your Lord. In other words, Rambam sees this verse as a promise in the future that Israel will ultimately return, will ultimately do teshuvah. Rambam does not list teshuvah as one of the 613 mitzvot of the Torah and Sefer HaMitzvot. However, he is somewhat unclear. He seems to suggest in at least two places that teshuvah is a mitzvah. In the Koteret, in the introduction to Hilkhot Teshuva, Rambam writes the following. Mitzvat asay achat. There's one mitzvat asay here. Vehu sheyashuv hachoteh mechetol lifnei Hashem veitvada. That the sinner should return, sheyashuv, from his sin and do vidui before God. Some suggest that here Rambam does argue that teshuvah is a mitzvah. The better argument is chapter 2 of Hilkhot Teshuva, where Rambam says, Eizohi Teshuva Gemura, what is absolute Teshuva? Ze shebala yado davar, etc. And he continues, Umahi HaTeshuva. Throughout chapter 2, Rambam seems to be suggesting that Teshuva indeed might be or is a mitzvah. I argue that actually Rambam does not list Teshuvah as a mitzvah. There are two aspects of Teshuvah. The open-ended Teshuvah, which is not a mitzvah deoraita. It's all-encompassing. It's not definable. How can such a broad idea be a specific mitzvah? In fact, in Shorish number 4, Rambam says this explicitly. Let me explain. Rambam wrote 14 shorashim, criteria for a mitzvah to be included in Sefer HaMitzvot. Shorish number 4, Rambam writes that a biblical commandment that is open-ended and all-encompassing, for example, the Torah says, Kedoshim tiyu, you shall be holy. This is not a specific mitzvah. Rather, it's a general value, a way of life. Similarly, open-ended teshuvah is a way of life. It cannot be a specific mitzvah. However, teshuvah that is definable, that is limited to sin, is indeed a mitzvah. Take, for example, what Rambam writes in chapter 3, Halacha Gimel. Rambam says the following. Habeinoni. Rambam tells us that we are all Bein Oni. There are Tzadikim Gemurim, absolute righteous people, Rishaim Gemurim, absolute evil people, and everybody else in between, where the scales are even in terms of our merits and our faults. Rambam says, Veha Beinoni, Tolin lo ad Yom HaKippurim. The Beinoni, we are hanging in balance until Yom Kippur. Im asat teshuvah nechtam lechaim. If the individual does teshuvah, he will be signed off for life. Ve'im lav nechtam lemita. And if he doesn't do teshuvah, he will be signed off, God forbid, for death. Here, Rambam is clearly describing sin-motivated teshuvah. However, if one goes to chapter 6, Halacha Hey, we hear a very different echo of teshuvah. Ze sheshalach lahem nevi'im, modi'im lahem darkei Hashem, umachzirim otam b'teshuvah. Hashem sent us prophets to educate us and to teach us darkei Hashem, the paths of God, and return in teshuvah. Here, Rambam speaks of an open-ended teshuvah, one that emerges from the education of the prophets, one that emerges from our being created b'tselem Elokim. The sin-motivated teshuvah finds expression in a mitzvah, and that mitzvah is called vidui. And indeed, Rambam lists vidui as a mitzvah in Sefer HaMitzvot, something we will discuss in our next shiur. But Rambam opens Hilkhot Teshuva with that which he considers to be a mitzvah deoraita. So, chapter 1, Halacha Aleph of Hilkhot Teshuva, Kol ha-mitzvot sheba Torah, all the mitzvot of the Torah, bein asay, bein lo tasay, positive or negative, im avar adam alachat mehen, if one transgresses any of them, bein bezadon, bein bishgaga, purposefully or by accident, kisheyaseh tshuva, when he does teshuvah, veyashuv mecheto, and returns from his sin, chayav lehidvatot lifnei Hashem, he must do vidui before Hashem. And herein lies the mitzvah that is subsumed under Teshuvah. It's the vidui. And that's how Rambam lists it in Sefer HaMitzvot. So let us summarize what we discussed in our first shiur on Hilkhot Teshuva. Number one, the concept of Teshuvah as a category of law is one of Rambam's most remarkable legal chidushim innovations. Number two, there are two halachic manifestations of Teshuvah: sin-related Teshuvah and open-ended Teshuvah. Teshuvah cannot and should not be seen merely as a response to sin. It is much more than that. It is a tool that opens our spirit to Hashem. It is no wonder that Teshuvah, like Torah, our Chachamim tell us, predates the creation of the world. And finally, underscoring the precision of language and ideas we expect from Rambam, open-ended Teshuvah is not a mitzvah deoraita, but sin-related Teshuvah is and finds expression in the vidui. Next week, we will discuss the nature of vidui and the nature of Teshuvah. Thank you for your attention.